Rising out of the highland plains of southern Africa, these ghostly grey walls lay empty for centuries before the first white man lay eyes upon them. The African people who lived around the ruins, the Shona, called them Zimbabwe, or sacred houses. But they offered outsiders no clues to the mysterious lost culture that had flourished here. To the would-be colonizers of this African heartland, the magnificent city spoke of some ancient white civilization that had burned brightly and gone out thousands of years ago. Some envisioned in these walls the biblical palace of the Queen of Sheba. Others saw a city established by the Phoenicians, venturing south from their Mediterranean homeland thousands of years before the birth of Christ. The Great Zimbabwe was none of these things. It stood at the heart of a thriving African culture, a magnet for trade from as far away as China, and a home to skilled artisans and stonemasons. But white colonizers, with a contempt born of arrogance, ravaged the city's legacy and plundered its ruins. Only today is the great Zimbabwe reclaiming its proud heritage.
From a scientific standpoint, it is an object lesson. Great Zimbabwe is probably the most abused archaeological site in the world and has been subject to more clearly incorrect speculation and also physical destruction by colonialists working at the site early in this century.
The battered, yet still stunning ruins of Great Zimbabwe sit at the head of a secluded mountain valley about 200 miles south of Zimbabwe's capital city of Harare. Sprawling over some 1,800 acres, the dense maze of walls and towers fashioned from local granite are the largest stone constructions south of the Sahara Desert.
The remarkable thing about this very beautiful masonry is that it is all done with dry stone walling, without the use of mortar, and apparently done with no preconceived architectural plan. It is being built in many ways like the cathedrals were built in Europe by a labor force that was working to a design that was in their heads rather than on paper.
Without question, the construction of these freestanding stone walls required great skill. But by the time the Portuguese explorers first rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, the city lay empty. The identity of its builders would remain a mystery to outsiders for hundreds of years. The Portuguese learned from Swahili traders of a fabulous abandoned city in the interior. These European Christians speculated that the rumors described the fabled capital of the Queen of Sheba, commissioned after her visit to Solomon. It would be almost another 400 years before the first European laid eyes on Great Zimbabwe. German geologist Karl Mauch seized on the theme of biblical origins for the site. I do not think I am far from wrong, he wrote, if I suppose that the ruin on the hill is a copy of Solomon's temple on Mount Moriah, and the building on the plain a copy of the place where the Queen of Sheba lived during her visit to Solomon.
The fact that the ruin complexes in southern Africa were supposed to be of biblical origin was very convenient to the Afrikaners in a number of respects. It gave a historical precedent for colonization, and in a sort of a double whammy, gave them also a biblical sanction for the colonization and exploitation of Africans.
Great Zimbabwe, like so much of Africa, would suffer cruelly under these imagined biblical sanctions. First came the big game hunters in 1880, hacking away the soapstone carvings of the strange animals and birds as artistic trophies over the protests of local people. Then a decade later came a more devastating incursion. Fortune hunters and English settlers, lured by the promise of African gold, flooded across the Limpopo River into the land of the Shona. Cecil Rhodes, the driving force behind this colonization, was determined to prove the theory that the Great Zimbabwe had been the capital of an ancient Phoenician colony.
And he did so because he was interested in establishing this foreign origin for these sites, again as a justification for the use of Africans as cheap mine labor, which was his main objective since he now controlled the original gold mines in the area. The interesting sidelight to this is that the African miners had been far too efficient, and the gold deposits in that area were largely exhausted by the time the whites got control of the area, and they were never really very profitable as a result. The Africans had basically beaten Rhodes to it by a few hundred years.
In 1902, a new curator was appointed to the Great Zimbabwe ruins, a journalist by the name of Richard Hall. It was under Hall's direction that the ruins would suffer the most abuse under the guise of archaeology.
He was specifically ordered not to excavate, but Hall had very blatantly racist attitudes, and he set out, and this is a direct quote from him, to remove the filth and decadence of Kaffir occupation from the site.
Hall had no archaeological training, but he had previously headed the Ancient Ruins Company, a colonial enterprise created to quarry African ruins for gold objects. In his eagerness to find evidence of the Phoenicians, Hall effectively stripped the ruins of all their African artifacts.
What he did then was to clear away the occupation debris from the entire interior of the great enclosure and much of what was left on the hill ruin, thus making it impossible to get precisely accurate archaeological dates for those sites. He did considerable damage to other ruins as well, removed many of the art objects, a number of which ended up in Cecil Rhodes' office as souvenirs, and did truly immeasurable damage to this archaeological site. You can see in this photograph the depth of the deposit that Hall removed. The tree in the center and that pillar of soil was the original ground level of the elliptical building when it was encountered by Europeans, and it appears to be almost 2 meters, 1.5 meters to 2 meters of stratified archaeological deposit, systematically removed and discarded.
Belatedly, Hall's pillaging of the site raised an outcry in England. In 1906, for the first time, a qualified archaeologist set foot in the ruins of Great Zimbabwe. David Randall McIver, upon surveying the devastation of the ancient city, almost despaired. Despite the damage, McIver soon found irrefutable evidence of the true builders of the mighty walls. His work would touch off a bitter dispute and eventually an appalling cover-up by a colonial government that would last for another 75 years. The scientific community had finally had enough of Hall's brutal treatment of the Zimbabwe ruins. They demanded that he be replaced.
So an unbiased professional archaeologist was sent in by the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1906, a fellow by the name of David Randall McIver, who conducted brief excavations in what was left of archaeological deposits at the site, and came to the conclusion that they were entirely of African origin and medieval in date, and he even estimated the age for the elliptical building at somewhere in the 15th century due to his knowledge of the Chinese glassware found in the site. This was a very astute observation because later radiocarbon and structural analysis places those buildings very close to that date.
MacIver had spoken the unspeakable, suggesting that the despised native Africans were capable of an achievement on the scale of Great Zimbabwe. His conclusions were dismissed out of hand by Rhodesia's white government. So volatile were the passions unleashed by MacIver's findings that it would be more than 2 decades before another qualified archaeologist was allowed onto the site. In 1929, Gertrude Caton Thompson investigated Great Zimbabwe, again at the request of the British Association. Her pioneering work in one of archaeology's first all-woman digs confirmed MacIver's discoveries. Every object she found was of African origin and medieval date. In her own words, she soon tired of the Phoenicians. Local settlers, meanwhile, made plans for a golf course in the ruins. That contempt for archaeological truth would only intensify when Ian Smith's white government broke with the British Commonwealth and rejected demands for black majority rule.
But Richard Orr's attempt to interpret Great Zimbabwe perhaps can be excused in the sense that this was a time when people really had a very, very sort of backward view about African civilization. What is surprising is that even during the UDI days, the days of Ian Smith, we find that Great Zimbabwe, there is an attempt to try and discredit the connection between Great Zimbabwe and the Africans.
In 1971, the head of Rhodesia's Antiquities Department resigned after receiving a secret directive from the breakaway white government. The directive prohibited any mention of the possibility of African origin in the official guidebook distributed to tourists at the ruins.
It shows the mysterious elliptical building, the ghost of the Queen of Sheba, and an African bowing down and offering tribute to this foreign power. And this is precisely the colonialist myth that was perpetuated around Zimbabwe for nearly 75 years.
In 1980, after a bloody civil war, the government of Rhodesia came under black majority rule. Finally, the people of Zimbabwe were free to search for their past among the ruins from which the newly independent country had taken its name.
What is important is that now, for the first time in the last 10 to 15 years, a body of African students are beginning to learn archaeological techniques and apply their own understandings, their intimate understandings of African culture to African archaeological sites, not only in Zimbabwe, but in many of the surrounding countries.
But the questions remained. How much of Zimbabwe's past could be reclaimed from the stripped ruins, and how much had been lost forever? The first people to settle at Great Zimbabwe were cattle farmers, who arrived in around AD 350. They were drawn by rich grazing land and a temperate climate free of the tsetse fly that plagued the cattle of the African lowlands with sleeping sickness.
The reason why Great Zimbabwe became a very big urban center is mainly due to the wealth accumulated from cattle wealth. There is quite a lot of evidence to show that the people at Great Zimbabwe were keeping quite a lot of cattle, and this cattle was used initially for local trade, and the wealth from the local trade went on to fuel international trade with the East Coast.
The people who would settle and exploit this rich region were ancestors of the present-day Shona people of Zimbabwe. They built mud and stick homes in and around their evolving stone walls.
Pottery, the pottery which was made during the Zimbabwe period is the same as the pottery which is made by the Shona people today. So that gives us a direct evidence to show that it was built by the ancestors of the Shona. The site was first occupied around 1900 AD. This was when they were not building in stone. They started building in stone around 1100 AD. And from 1100 AD to about 1450 AD, the site was occupied, and it grew from a small village to a very big urban center.
Pottery shards and beads dating to around 1100 testify to the city's rapid rise as a commercial center. By 1300, the Zimbabweans were trading their gold and ivory down the nearby Sabi River to the coast, exchanging them for beads and porcelain from as far away as China.
And what you see here are examples of Arabic pottery. This is the decoration fused into the shed, and these are Arabic pottery ware with this one, which had a small piece of lettering, Arabic lettering, at one end, but it's not very visible now. And the rest you see are Chinese, which came in through trade.
In the 1300s, as Europe was nearing the end of its Middle Ages, the great Zimbabwe's master masons began work on their most enduring monument, the Great Enclosure. More recent than the hill ruins, the enclosure testifies to the confidence and skill of a thriving culture.
For example, the entrances up the hill, most of them are round entrances. In the valley and in the great enclosure, you tend to get square entrances. You also tend to get quite a lot of conical towers within the great enclosure and the valley ruins. I think this is a development which comes in later when people now add on new things with development of skills. They can now do quite a lot of other things which they couldn't do in the hill. And this is seen in the great enclosure with the conical tower, as I said, as well as with some of the platforms, which are very, very sort of intricate. There is also a new development at the great enclosure, the idea of decoration. The decorations are now much more elaborate, as is shown by the double chevron pattern at the back of the great enclosure.
"20,000 tourists now visit the Great Zimbabwe each year, eager to reclaim for themselves some of the city's rich heritage. Clambering among the ruins and scavenging for keepsakes, they are taking their toll on the ancient stone walls. The caretakers of the site have recently enlisted the help of modern technology to preserve the labor of long-dead masons. In the most fragile areas, each surface stone is marked and entered into a computer. When walls collapse, advanced architectural programs will plot their reconstruction. Berzak Dube surveys the walls with a keen eye for signs of structural failure, classifying the walls into 3 categories of vulnerability.
The walls that normally collapse are the P walls. Our walls are generally small walls and they normally don't give us problems. But P walls collapse most of the time because the bonding between adjacent blocks is not very good compared to the Q wall styles.
Why Great Zimbabwe itself finally crumbled is still a mystery. At its height, the city may have had some 18,000 inhabitants, as many as medieval London. Archaeologists believe that Zimbabwe, like many large cities, simply overtaxed its resources.
There's quite a lot of exploitation of the land. This led to erosion, clearing of forests, and this led to shortage of firewood. And again, with time, with the exploitation of the environment, this could no longer be supported, and hence it was abandoned.
The truth the Zimbabweans may have understood was the one expressed by the archaeologist Gertrude Caton Thompson in 1929, when she wrote that an African origin for the Zimbabwe ruins enriches, not impoverishes, our wonderment at their remarkable achievement. It cannot detract from their inherent majesty. Rising out of the heart of Africa, the great Zimbabwe is today a monument to a mighty African civilization that thrived while Europe languished. The city's ruin will forever bear the scars of ignorance and racism. But her true African origins and the greatness of her people can never again be denied.
The discovery of the Bonampak frescoes unraveled mysteries on the customs and traditions of a civilization that had developed over a period of nearly 3,000 years. A civilization that reached its height between 200 and 900 AD, and then experienced a relentless decline until it almost completely disappeared around 1500, a little before the Spanish conquistadors arrived. The cities were abandoned and slowly swallowed up by the jungle. Yet the people who once lived in them had not disappeared. They merely scattered throughout the region now known as the Yucatan Peninsula in present-day Mexico, where the ancient traditions of the Maya are still present. Archaeologist John Lloyd Stevens wrote these words in his diary on May 11, 1840, about his expedition to Mexico. In the history of the world, nothing impressed me more than the sight of this big and attractive city, now barren and lost. Stevens had set off many months earlier on the tracks of stories about cities hidden in the wild tropical jungle and a people who had mysteriously disappeared. His journey through uncharted terrain must have been difficult, with scorching temperatures and thick vegetation. And though on previous trips he had examined Egyptian pyramids, ancient monuments in Italy, and Greek temples in Athens, it was here in the jungles of Central America that he was overwhelmed by an intense feeling of astonishment. He walked out of the forest and suddenly realized that he had reached the ruins of an ancient Maya city, Palenque. Stevens and an architect, Frederick Catherwood, who painted watercolors of the area, were breathless when they saw the city's sacred grounds. It was clear that only men with ingenious minds could have planned this city, and that expert hands had built it. It was also clear that a whole new era of scholarship on an unexplored civilization would now present itself. Gods and goddesses, rulers and heroes, an entire account of hidden Maya culture and mythic history. At the time of its splendor, Palenque covered an area of over 6 square miles with a population of tens of thousands. The most important structures date from the period between 630 and 700 AD, when Kin Pakal and his son Chan Balum ruled the kingdom. The palace, the home of the royal family, was erected in the city center on a 33-foot-high platform. The palace in reality was just a group of various buildings built one against the other, but in its own way it was an architectural masterpiece, with cellars, chambers, and rooms with rather low ceilings arranged around a courtyard. The bas-reliefs that decorate the walls are still striking today, even though many of the colors, which Stevens and Catherwood marveled about, have almost completely faded. Some glyphs, the round-figured ideograms which Maya writing is composed of, were carved into the steps of the middle court, while along the walls, stone plates were decorated with images of prisoners who must have been high-ranking officials judging from their rich garments. From the western side of the palace is a full view of the majestic Temple of the Inscriptions. In 1952, archaeologist Alberto Ruiz made an incredible discovery inside this pyramid-like structure. On the upper platform, he discovered a deep passage, a kind of tunnel that penetrated into the pyramid. The tunnel had been blocked for centuries by tons of earth and stones, so the descent into the depths of the structure was difficult and dangerous. After months of digging, Alberto Ruiz descended the entire length of the tunnel. He reached an underground room where he discovered a great sarcophagus containing the tomb of King Kin Pakal, who lived at Palenque in 700 AD. It was one of the most important. For the inhabitants of Palenque, the most important buildings in the city were those making up a group now called the Cross Group. It is composed of 3 rectangular buildings surmounted by a crest-like structure. They are temples dedicated to Maya divinities and owe their name to a mistake made by the first discoverers who mistook the symbol of the ceiba, the cosmic tree of the Maya, for the Christian cross. At the height of its splendor, this grand architecture in the middle of a dense jungle must have been a truly impressive sight. All the buildings were painted red, to the Maya, the color of life. The main temple was decorated with stuccos portraying King Pakal together with the god Kappa, protector of the ruling class. All the bas-reliefs of the buildings at Palenque prove that the cult of the gods was tied to the social class that worshippers belonged to. The god Ekchua, for instance, was the guardian of merchants. Even the colors used in pictures had to conform to precise rules. People's skin was colored red. Gods were painted in blue, the color of the sky, and animals and plants were painted yellow. Maya society was structured like a pyramid, headed by a king who had divine powers, similar to the powers of ancient Egyptian pharaohs. Below the king were the priests, nobility, and warriors. At the bottom of the pyramid was the rest of the population, mostly peasants and craftsmen. The peasants led a relatively quiet life. There were no carts on the streets, since the Maya did not know the wheel. Their city markets were small and drew only a few people. You might hear the call of turkeys and see a few buyers and sellers bargaining over various goods. But most of the inhabitants had their own fruit orchards and vegetable gardens. There were craftsmen, however, who made special objects not sold in the markets. Objects made of jade. This hard, durable, beautiful mineral was so precious that only members of the nobility were able to afford it and hire the skilled craftsmen necessary to work with it. Jade objects would have been traded in one of the richest cities of the Yucatan, Chichen Itza. Chichen Itza was founded at the end of the 8th century AD and represented the consolidation of a powerful Maya state sustained by trade, tribute, and war. In the middle of town there was a great pyramid known as El Castillo, the castle, which apparently was dedicated to the worship of Kukulkan, the Maya name of the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl. The 365 steps of the Castillo suggest that the building functioned as a giant chronographic marker, and on the days of the equinox, the sun casts a shadow that illuminates a serpent on the north staircase. Not surprisingly, Kukulkan's symbol was a feathered serpent. At the top, the Maya had erected a vaulted temple decorated with bas-reliefs depicting warriors. Only priests were entitled to officiate at ceremonies and appear in front of the population from the height where the temples were erected. The Temple of the Warriors served a different role, however, for it was here that the Maya engaged in sacrificial rites. In the early years of the first millennium, the Maya were thought of as peaceful timekeepers and skywatchers. But around 1000 AD, they encountered another people, the Toltecs, who imposed their culture and ruling lifestyle upon the Maya. Their influence is seen in the similarities between the buildings and sculptures at Chichen Itza and those at Tula, the Toltec capital, hundreds of miles away. One of the best examples is El Caracol, an imaginative building in the shape of a spiral whirl of a conch, an attribute of Kukulkan, whom the structure embodies. Kukulkan was identified with the planet Venus, and from tiny upper-story windows in this structure, one could observe this mythical planet. The Maya were familiar with the positions of the stars and studied their movements. In keeping track of the solar and lunar years and the cycles of visible planets, they developed a highly sophisticated long-count calendar that dated back to August 13th, 3114 BC. The influence of the Toltecs is also seen in the comparison of stone sculptures from Tula called Chacmul with the one at the Temple of the Warriors at Chichen Itza. Under the influence of the Toltecs, the old system of government was eradicated. Warrior kings replaced more benign monarchs and priests. And the practice of human sacrifice was introduced. An example of this is seen in the Chacmul at the top of the stairway of the Temple of the Warriors. A reclining statue is faced toward El Castillo, holding a bowl in his hand. It is here where they put the hearts torn out of the chests of sacrificial victims. Sports and ball playing were part of daily life at Chichen Itza, except there was a lot more riding on the outcomes than prizes or trophies. They played a game called pelota, and the ball court at Chichen Itza was the largest in Central America, 560 feet long and 165 feet wide. The object of the game, which was more a religious rite than recreational, was to throw a rubber ball into a stone hoop. What made the task hard was the fact that players couldn't use their hands or feet. They had to use their hips or elbows to move the ball. A bas-relief shows two teams competing against each other. But this bas-relief shows the bloody outcome. A player who was defeated is being decapitated. The fate of players from the losing side. A long platform bears depictions of skulls, presumably the skulls of the losers. But according to some scholars, winners as well might have been beheaded. It was considered an honor, having won, to go to a heaven of warriors. The practice of human sacrifice was described by Bishop Diego de Landa, a Spaniard who lived in the 16th century. He himself was guilty of committing a number of crimes while attempting to convert the inhabitants to Christianity. Among these, the so-called auto da fe, or public burning of money, in which all written documents from this classical period of the Maya were destroyed by fire. The Maya were the first people of the New World to keep historical records, with a written history that begins in 50 BC. But today, only 4 of thousands of books written in hieroglyphs still exist, one of which is the so-called Dresden Codex. Maya books were made of fig tree bark folded like an accordion. Although everyone could learn how to write, only priests were allowed to compile books and read sacred scriptures. The greatest difficulty in deciphering Maya writing lies in interpreting the glyphs, since they are based on a system that combines ideograph and phonetic elements. It's a complicated system that was finally unraveled by Russian epigraphist Yuri Norosev, who wrote the first Mayan grammar that was published in 1950. The territory inhabited by the Maya was vast, and since horses and donkeys had become extinct on the continent tens of thousands of years earlier, to make foot travel easier, the Maya built roads. Actually, an entire road system that linked key cities to places of pilgrimage. Uxmal was one of the most important places of worship of Maya civilization, and reached its peak between the 8th and 11th centuries AD. Uxmal was the administrative and religious capital of the Maya, who lived in the hilly zone of Puuc, a name also used for the region's peculiar architectural style. The finest example of Puuc style is the governor's palace, nearly 330 feet long, probably the seat of the authorities. The building has a cornice decorated with masks portraying the god Chak. It was originally entirely colored like all Maya buildings, and the elaborate renderings of gods and symbols attest to the wide range of Maya interests. However, the most majestic monument at Uxmal was the pyramid, or Temple of the Magician. It was erected primarily to worship the gods of heaven, but it too served as an observatory to study the movements of celestial bodies. Like the governor's palace, the pyramid was decorated with representations of the mask of the god Chak. This sculpture, portraying the tattooed face of a priest coming out of a serpent's mouth, was discovered inside the pyramid. The buildings at Uxmal exhibit the high level of perfection reached by Maya stone carvers. Not all Maya settlements were situated in the middle of the jungle. Fortified cities were also erected by the sea to make the coast safer. One of these places, built by the Caribbean Sea, was Tulum. This was the site of the first meeting in 1518 of the Maya and the Spanish who arrived by sea. The conquistadors had to be amazed to see such a formidable city in this beautiful natural setting. In the Temple of the Frescoes are some of the most awe-inspiring Maya paintings that have stood the test of time. There are illustrations of the gods of the Maya pantheon that dominated the universe of the living as well as of the dead. The drawings evidence a culture that was sensitive to the importance of color. When Captain Juan de Grijalva landed for the first time on the shore of Tulum, he thought it looked as big as Seville in his native Spain. He would have seen buildings painted in vermilion red, light blue, white, and bright green. Unfortunately, only a few traces of these colors remain today. The castle, or El Castillo of Tulum, is certainly the most important monument of this city. It was partly destroyed in the early 20th century and was restored based upon the illustration Catherwood made of it when he arrived in Tulum. No one was sure of the function of El Castillo until Michael Kramer, an archaeologist of the National Geographic Society, reached the conclusion that it was a lighthouse used for navigation. In fact, not very far from Tulum is the island of Cozumel, which in Mayan language means place of the swallows. In ancient times, there were many vessels that sailed back and forth between the island and the mainland. The sailors of these boats probably relied on the help of lighthouses like the one at Tulum to get their bearings. The Maya enjoyed a civilization and a culture that is a study in contrasts. They had respect for nature and considered animals sacred, And yet, the animal called human was expendable in sacrifice. Blood was the mortar of Maya life. They were great historians and builders, and yet it never came to them that the wheel could be used as a means of transport. They were superstitious and feared thunder and lightning, but studied and predicted astral phenomena with modern precision. The contradictions of the Maya represent their greatest mystery. What we do know is that they spent their time in unison with the forces of the universe. Poet Miguel Ángel Asturias wrote, "The Maya were a people who counted their days like diamonds. They had faith in their gods, in their smoke rites, in dreams, and in the wisdom of words, things that 5 centuries of devastation, exploitation, and oblivion could not destroy. The Maya live on, thanks to what they have left for our civilization to discover."